My name is Victor. I'm 28 years old, and I had one simple dream: to buy my own apartment. A typical goal for any adult, right? But life never goes according to plan. There's always some crazy twist waiting to knock you off course. In my case, that twist had a name: Melissa. She was my dad's new wife, a decade younger than him, and somehow managed to have him wrapped so tightly around her finger that he'd sign any piece of paper she waved in his face. Didn't matter if it was a grocery list or a legal contract. He wouldn't blink. The moment Melissa walked into our lives, everything started spiraling downhill. You know that gut feeling when you just sense disaster looming, like standing next to a dumpster fire before it really ignites? That was how I felt about her. She had this aura, like she'd shoot you with a bedazzled pink revolver if you so much as glanced in her direction. And guess who her favorite target was? My dad. Except instead of bullets, she was using business ideas. One day, Dad comes to me with a pitch that would make any sane person pause. "Victor, son, I've got a great plan. Melissa and I are starting a new business, and we need just a small investment from you. A tiny fraction of your savings. You want to help your family, right? I mean, who doesn't want to help family? But the savings he was talking about? That was my sweat, my overtime hours, my weekends traded for money I planned to put toward my own future." "Seriously, Dad?" I asked, completely dumbfounded. But my father had a gift, a real talent for talking you into things you didn't want to do. He had this way of making everything sound temporary, a mere blip before success arrived. "As soon as the business takes off, you'll get your money back, with interest," he said. It was like hearing a fairy tale bedtime story, comforting but completely unrealistic. Still, I had this nagging sense in the pit of my stomach, like the one you get watching a horror movie when the main character inches towards the basement door. Everyone's screaming, "Don't go in there!" But the character always does. I guess in this case, I was that character, because instead of standing my ground and saying no, I let myself be convinced. I stepped into the dark, thinking things would turn out okay. Spoiler: they didn't. The moment I agreed, Melissa's smile was like that of a shark who'd just sunk its teeth into dinner. Little did I know, by the time I handed over the check, I was already in her trap, and my dad was happily holding the leash. Melissa and my dad decided to open a beauty salon. Sounds harmless, right? Just a quaint little place that smells of nail polish and broken dreams, where everything is glazed over with optimism, even if it's built on delusions of grandeur. I genuinely tried to be supportive. I visited a few times, pretending that this investment wasn't setting my savings on fire. You know that moment when you stare at a house with crumbling walls, telling yourself it'll hold for another 50 years. That's how I felt watching them build their empire. At first glance, things didn't seem too awful. Customers came in, laughing with the stylists, while my dad threw around phrases like, "We're going to expand soon." I'd raise an eyebrow at that every time, because his version of expanding translated more to, "We're about to lose everything for a pipe dream." But instead of throwing in the towel, I'd convince myself it was just a rough start. After all, what new business doesn't face some challenges? Every visit was a carbon copy of the last. Melissa, in full dictator mode, barking orders like a general, leading a battalion into battle. And my dad? He followed along like a soldier who'd been brainwashed into believing his sole purpose in life was to be her personal marionette. "Melissa decided this. Melissa thinks we should do that," he'd say, with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found life's meaning in being her mouthpiece. Let me tell you, Melissa was like a miniature version of Napoleon in a pink tunic, running her salon with the misplaced confidence of someone who believes they've got an MBA in one hand and a sword in the other. Only problem: that sword was blunt, and the business plan had more holes in it than a worn-out fishing net. Meanwhile, there I was, sitting back and watching my hard-earned money float into space. That internal voice of reason, my gut, kept whispering, "Victor, it's time to bail, dude. Cut your losses." But did I listen? Of course not. I stuck around, probably because walking away would have felt too much like admitting defeat. Every time I tried to voice my concerns, Melissa would pounce like a lioness guarding her territory. "What do you know about business?" she'd snarl. Do you even understand customer relations? And for some reason, I found myself questioning if common sense had simply died in that room. What baffled me the most was how my dad stood by her. This was the same man who used to teach me life lessons and give advice with the wisdom of someone who'd lived through it all. Now, it was like he'd been swapped with a version of himself that was hardwired to follow her whims. He backed her up at every turn, as if someone had flicked off his logic switch. Melissa said, so that's how it'll be. Yeah, right. Like that approach was going to end well. Months passed, and the Grand Salon, the brilliant business venture of Melissa and my dad, began crumbling like an overbaked cake. At first, everything seemed passable. But you know when you're cruising along and suddenly realize you're sliding down a hill with no brakes? That's exactly what was happening. The clients stopped showing up. Either everyone in town suddenly lost interest in getting their nails done, or more likely, word got around that Melissa was no entrepreneurial genius. Whatever the reason, the place started smelling like failure, and not the subtle kind either. It reeked. As for expenses, oh, they were multiplying like rabbits, while income, let's just say it was about as rare as spotting a unicorn. But did Melissa ever admit she was in over her head? Of course not. The blame game started immediately. Who was responsible for their little empire sinking? Take your pick. The clients, the staff, the economy, global warming, anyone and anything but Melissa herself. It was impressive, really. If there were a gold medal for deflecting blame, she'd be standing on the podium with the national anthem playing in the background. My poor dad, he was caught in the middle, like a deer in the headlights. He was hanging on to the dream of saving the business, as if it was his last lifeboat on the Titanic. So what did he do? Came to me again, of course. Victor, son, we just need a little more investment. A final push, and I know we can turn things around. Seriously? That last investment went as well as a lead balloon, and now he wanted me to throw good money after bad? But this time, I was ready. I told him straight up, no more money. I'd already sunk everything I had into their disaster of a business. The look on his face was priceless, like I'd just told him his beloved childhood dog ran away. He tried to pull the family card, talking about responsibility and loyalty, but I'd already seen how this tragic comedy played out. I wasn't about to bankroll their second act. That's when things really started to unravel. Melissa and my dad, who once put on their happy couple act in front of the clients, couldn't even keep it up anymore. The cracks were so wide, you could drive a truck through them. They started bickering behind closed doors, then in front of staff, and finally, they didn't even bother hiding it from the few clients still clinging to the sinking ship. What had once been a business turned into a two-person circus act, with both of them walking around the salon in sour moods, pretending the other didn't exist. It was a textbook case of what happens when you build a business on vanity and ignorance. A few more weeks limped by, and then the inevitable happened. The salon officially declared bankruptcy. Shocking, right? My hard-earned savings had evaporated, as if they'd never existed. My dad fell into a funk, sitting at home, staring at old pictures of his younger, hopeful self, back when he thought everything in life was still possible. And Melissa? Oh, she did what anyone with her level of commitment would do. She vanished, packed her pink suitcases and disappeared into the sunset as if she'd never even been there. Just a couple of days after their grand salon empire collapsed like a house of cards, my dad showed up at my doorstep looking like a hero, with no battle left to fight. Only instead of a sword or shield, he came armed with some news that made me raise an eyebrow. Turns out, Melissa had packed her bags and skipped town. But here's the kicker. She didn't just leave quietly. No, she cleaned out whatever was left in their bank accounts on her way out. Yep, that's right. She didn't slam the door behind her. She took the last pennies they had as if to say, "Thanks for playing, boys." My dad stood there in front of me like a man who'd just been told the apocalypse had arrived, and all his doomsday preps were useless. He mumbled, "I can't believe she'd do something like this," as if he hadn't just lived through the past year, watching her pull off her best impression of a scheming villain. And me? I just stood there, arms crossed, unsure of what the appropriate reaction was. Part of me felt bad for him, sure. He looked like life had chewed him up and spat him out. But the other part of me was screaming, "Seriously, dude? You let this happen? You let her sink everything, including my future, with your eyes wide open?" Inside, I was like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. It was a mess of emotions, rage, disbelief, frustration. Was I supposed to comfort him? Pity him for being an oblivious victim? Or should I knock some sense into him for dragging me into his chaos, ruining not just his financial future, but mine too? There was a real mental tug-of-war going on in my head. One side said, "He's your father! He's broken! Help him!" While the other side, dripping with sarcasm, snarled, "Oh, sure. Pity the guy who flushed everything down the toilet with his eyes closed." My dad, though, was on a roll. He couldn't stop talking about how he'd lost it all. His dreams, his business, his great love, the whole 9 yards. His monologue was like watching a blend of Greek tragedy and a soap opera you secretly watch for the over-the-top drama. Somewhere between his self-pity and his lamenting about the lost love of his life, it finally hit me like a ton of bricks. Melissa never loved him. Not even for a second. This wasn't about romance or partnership. It was business. She saw my dad as a walking, talking ATM, a resource she could drain dry. And once she'd squeezed the last drop out of him, she vanished like the ghost of bad decisions. That realization hurt, not just for my dad's sake, but for mine too. I had been caught in the same trap. We were both just pawns in her game, a means to her self-serving end. While my dad lost his business, I lost my savings, my dream of a future. And as much as I wanted to be angry at him, I realized that in this twisted mess, we were both victims of the same master manipulator. Once the dust settled and it became painfully clear that my dad was completely broken, I had one of those light bulb moments. If I didn't step up and take charge, no one would. My dad, in his current state, was so useless he could probably land a job serving drinks at his own funeral. The guy had become a shadow of himself, aimlessly floating through life, while the ship, our ship, was sinking fast. So, guess who got stuck with the job of cleaning up this epic disaster? Yep, yours truly. Taking the initiative wasn't exactly something I was thrilled about. But when everyone else is running around in a panic, screaming that the world's ending, sometimes you've got to take the wheel and steer the ship, even if it feels like you're heading straight into a storm. I rolled up my sleeves and started with the boring stuff, sorting through the mess of debts and financial documents. It was like trying to solve a crossword puzzle that someone spilled coffee all over. Chaos doesn't even begin to cover it. Melissa hadn't just left behind shattered dreams, she left behind a financial minefield. Each document was a potential bomb. One wrong move and everything could blow up in my face. At first I thought I was just dealing with standard issue messiness, you know, the kind you'd expect from someone like Melissa. But the deeper I dove into the paperwork, the uglier it got. And then I found out the real kicker. My dad wasn't even a full owner of the salon. Nope. The whole circus, from the name on the business license to the liability, was entirely in Melissa's hands. My dad had been signing papers left and right like he was at an autograph signing session at Comic-Con, not even bothering to glance at what he was agreeing to. And that's when it hit me. Melissa had been playing chess this whole time, while my dad didn't even know there was a game going on. But here's where things started to turn around. Since Melissa had vanished into thin air, I managed, through a whirlwind of legal wrangling and bureaucratic nightmares, to gain some control over whatever assets were left. It wasn't easy. In fact, it felt like running a marathon, only instead of just hitting walls of exhaustion, I was also dodging flaming obstacles. Every new discovery had me shaking my head, shouting, "Are you kidding me?" Legal issues? Yeah, those were about as enjoyable as getting a root canal without anesthesia. But step by painful step, I started to steer the ship back on course. It was like playing a high-stakes game of Jenga, trying to pull out the pieces without letting the whole tower crash down. Bit by bit, I started recovering pieces of what they'd lost. My savings? Gone. That dream was long dead and buried. But if I had to be the one to rescue this sinking show, I was doing it on my terms, my way. I wasn't about to let my dad's mistakes and Melissa's scheming be the final chapter. No way. I'd take what was left, piece it together, and at least try to salvage something from the wreckage. As I started cleaning up the mess Melissa had left, honestly, I was shocked. It seemed like she hadn't just run away. She'd thrown one last fireworks show before leaving. Debts, fraud, and unpaid taxes hit me like an avalanche. It was like, "Congratulations, you're now the owner of all this chaos." Yeah, sounds like an epic prize, right? If only it came with one small catch. But here's the thing. This chaos gave me an advantage I hadn't even considered. Every step of this process was like walking through a minefield. One moment, an illegal contract would pop up, and the next, I'd find unpaid taxes that hadn't been paid for months. But here's the kicker. Legally, since Melissa just vanished without leaving a trace or making any claims to anything, I ended up ahead. She took herself out of the game, and that was her biggest mistake. The legal procedures weren't exactly fun. More like going to the dentist with a promise it would be painless. But I managed to go through the courts and get everything they had purchased with the money I'd invested back under my control. You should have seen the judge's face when I told this whole story. I think even he couldn't believe how tangled everything was. And so, imagine this. I became the owner of everything. The salon, whatever assets were left, even the money that somehow stayed in the accounts and hadn't been whisked away by Melissa. It was a strange moment because, despite all the madness, I'd come out on top. Not exactly the happy ending I'd pictured, but hey, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. Or in my case, you become the owner of an entire beauty salon and a bunch of assets nobody had bothered to claim. When all the paperwork was signed, sealed, and as they say, triple-checked, just to be sure, I honestly started feeling like I was the master of my life. There it was, the moment of triumph. The business started to recover, and I almost believed that I could finally relax. But as fate would have it, right at that moment, Melissa suddenly resurfaced. Apparently, she decided to stage her final act of, "I'm still here." She showed up, acting like nothing had happened, with that same smirk that screamed, "I'm back, baby, and now everything will go my way." She clearly thought her return was like a grand finale where she'd start giving orders again, and I'd just stand on the sidelines watching my savings vanish. But this time, I was ready. Very ready. When she started feeding me lines about how we can get everything back on track, and how she just needed a little time to figure things out, I simply smiled and pulled out my documents. You should have seen her face when I showed her the papers that proved everything, and I mean everything, now belonged to me. The salon, the assets, even that old cash register that was the only thing working till the end. She tried to play the victim. "This is all a misunderstanding. You can't do this. It was our joint business." But my lawyers, shout out to them, had everything covered. I calmly explained that she no longer had any rights. Everything she thought she could reclaim was now officially mine, and no manipulation or blackmail was going to help her. Of course, Melissa tried to threaten me, pulling out all her usual tricks. "I'll sue you. You'll pay for this." But this time her words were just empty air. My lawyers were a step ahead on everything. I watched as her confidence melted away like sugar in hot tea. She realized she'd lost, and at that moment it hit me. I had finally taken control of this mess. I was no longer the pawn she moved around her board. Now I was the king of this game, and there was nothing Melissa could do about it. Failing to achieve anything, she gathered the last shreds of her dignity and left, this time for good. Now I was the owner of the salon and, well, everything they'd accumulated over that time. Imagine that. From being the guy who invested money and hoped for the best, I turned into the person running this whole circus. Restoring the business wasn't an easy task, but I was already operating on a different level. Now everything was done by my rules, and certainly without any Melissas and their genius ideas. I tossed out everything they had put in place like old magazines and started building my business from scratch. I wish I could say it was as easy as snapping my fingers, but no, it was harder than convincing a bartender to give you a free drink. But here's the funny thing. I didn't just get my money back. I got more. Every month brought profit, And now the salon was really working. No more silly decisions like, let's triple the prices to make more money. Just hardcore but sensible work. And you know what? I was proud of myself. This was my journey, and I was carving it out step by step. Every time I walked into the salon and saw everything working as it should, I felt a sense of victory, like I'd won a marathon I never even wanted to run. As for my dad, he was broken, and it showed. His dreams had collapsed, and he found himself at the center of all this madness that he'd created himself. But I didn't blame him. Well, at least not out loud. He'd made his mistakes, just like I had, and honestly, it was a lesson for both of us. I didn't want to stomp on him while he was down because I'd already realized we're all responsible for our own decisions, and he'd chosen the wrong path. It happens, and me? I'd become the master of my fate. No more crazy wives of my dad, no more ridiculous projects. Everything was under my control. Nothing could stop me now. Neither people nor circumstances. I had built this business myself, and if anyone thought I'd give up or make another mistake like before, they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with.